Hello, everyone. Welcome. Is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Hi, it feels like a party in here, which is wonderful and so appropriate. My name is Denise Cruz, and I'm chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia. With thanks to the SOF Heyman Center and New Books in the Arts and Sciences series, it's my pleasure to introduce this celebration of Nicholas Dames and his wonderful book, The Chapter. I know, right? I know that you're here to hear him and the panelists and not me, so I will move to introduce this panel quickly. But I did want to say congratulations to Nick for this remarkable and impactful book, a book that was written as much for readers as it was for scholars and writers. This is a book that you will want to dive into, to spend time with. It theorizes, historicizes, makes sense of the chapter as a unit of literary production, of reading and temporal experience. It's remarkable for its scale, its breadth, its luminous lines of prose. Nick and I are both fans of triads and lists. I am thrilled to celebrate its publication alongside this group of readers, scholars, teachers, and writers, and you. Nicholas Dames is a Theodore Kahan Professor of the Humanities, a specialist in the history and theory of the novel. Alongside his scholarly books and articles, Dames writes frequently on contemporary fiction and the humanities for The Atlantic, N+1, The Nation, The New Yorker, The New York Times Book Review, and Public Books, where he has been co-editor-in-chief since 2020. With Jenny Davidson, he's co-editor of the Rereadings book series at Columbia University Press, and of course, he's our celebrant tonight. Merve Emre is the Shapiro Silverberg Professor of Creative Writing and Criticism at Wesleyan University and the director of the Shapiro Center for Creative Writing and Criticism. She's the author of The Making of Bad Readers in Postwar America, The Ferrante Letters, and The Personality Brokers. And among her many other projects is finishing a book titled Post-Discipline, Two Futures for Literary Study. Joseph Howley is Associate Professor of Classics and currently the Paul Brook Program Chair for Literature Humanities in Columbia College. He's a scholar of ancient Rome with interest in intellectual culture and history of the book and reading. He's published on ancient essays, 15th century tables of contents, and early 20th century phonographs, and is currently writing a book about slave labor and the Roman book. Professor Dennis Yutanen is an associate professor of English at Columbia University, where he also co-directs the Center for Comparative Media. He's the author of the new book, Literary Theory for Robots from Norton, coming out in February, and we will be celebrating that book in the spring. Please join me in welcoming our panelists and Nick.
Thank you, Denise. And thank you to the panelists for being here. And my God, thank you all for being here. I don't think I felt like this since my high school reunion. I mean, this is, maybe the remarks I'd like to offer today would come as two questions. It seemed like that would be necessary for me to launch the book in a sense. What is the chapter, my book, and what is the chapter? So let me start with the first question. What is the chapter? What is this book? It's a 2,000-year-long history. And to be clear, it didn't take 2,000 years to write, although it really feels like it in retrospect, of a particular mode of textual segmentation and how that mode finally takes root and flourishes becomes something like an aesthetic form in the novel. That means a number of ancillary things, I think almost maybe too many ancillary things. It's a study of different habits in book design. It's a study of what in calculus is called DT, the time differential, the registration of change in the moment of change. One source of this project actually were the old Eliotic paradoxes about how time is divided, Achilles and the tortoise, the arrow that never reaches its target. Those became uncannily influential for me as I was writing. The book can also be thought of as a place where information science meets theories of time or theories of narrative or the poetics of storytelling. And then maybe the final way I'd put it is it's what a philosopher might call a mirology. that is a theory of parts and part relations, but a theory of parts and part relations for one particular kind of part in one particular form primarily, and that's the novel. Because what's fascinated me for a long time is the gappiness of narratives and where that gappiness, where those sutures, the caesures of the novel come from, how the novel, I guess, my question would be how the novel discusses the experience of passing over a gap, either a small or a large transition, how feelings of departure and arrival can coincide, the way those gaps can be fleeting or minor or almost invisible, and yet also potentially immense and consequential, the way they can feel chosen, deliberate, or imposed from somewhere else, part of some alien time scheme, the way they can reflect shifts in ongoing continuity, but also ruptures to continuity. Now, one impetus behind my writing the book was thinking about the novel form as a cognitive and maybe even haptic training in how time is experienced. It's a way for me to reflect on actually what a life of novel reading had trained me to experience in terms of how time passes, how it had trained me in a certain kind of rhythm. Now, admittedly, this book also had different iterations, both in the page and in my head. I'm embarrassed to say it started its life as an elegantly slim 70,000 word little treatise. It ended considerably more distended, which turns out also to be a lesson from the history of chaptering. The distension is because of a kind of surprise that was waiting for me shortly after I started my work on it, and that is that I'd have to keep pushing backwards in time. I'd have to keep pushing backwards before the novel, before print, and ultimately even before the codex, which was maybe the biggest surprise for me. And what that means is beyond or before, as it happens, something like literariness. So the first title of the book, and the title under which I conceived of it, A Literary History of the Chapter, a title to which I was, for a while quite attached. And it was my editor, who's here in the back, who brilliantly talked me out of it. I did get to keep the word history, though. It's in the subtitle. And that is important. But she was, in fact, quite right. This isn't only a literary history. It's a history of how technique emerges into something like literariness. So second question would be, what is the chapter? And maybe a subsidiary question, how unique are chapters? I was once given by a friend an analogy for what I was doing. The analogy was that I was doing the kind of thing that historians of science do when they don't actually describe the results of experiments, but they describe the kind of glass used to construct test tubes which allow the experiments to occur. I think this was actually an insult. But I realized it did capture something about what I was up to. However, the chapter isn't just a test tube. It has a kind of affective shape, a charge. It's a container, but one that can become something like an object of desire, or even a meta language for a kind of desire, for a certain kind of way to live in time. And my one anecdote about this is that shortly after I was told that I was studying the glass in test tubes, or of test tubes, I was walking down the street in Queens, I believe, and saw an ad, and this will give you some sense of how long this project has been in gestation. I was walking past a Radio Shack, of all things. Those still existed while this book was in gestation, and there was an ad for a particular cell phone service, I can't remember which depicted a youngish woman holding a very small child, sitting on a sofa with a look on her face of relief. The sole text on the ad was a new chapter. Now, the ad, patently seemed to be about domestic abuse and about a woman who had just fled her abuser. And that signaled to me something about the fact that this isn't just the glass of test tubes, that there's a electrical charge to the divisions in time that word chapter can articulate, that I was right to kind of hold on to. I was right to see as worth discussing. Now, chapter is a weird thing, though. It's a form, in one sense, and a paratext, to use Jeanette's term, while also being not quite either of them. Think of the ability, for instance, of the chapter to travel across linguistic or cultural barriers with total ease, without any difficulty, because the chapter is not entirely language. it is an aspect of page design to some extent. It is a paratext. It can move between languages, but it's also an aesthetic shape, or to some extent an aesthetic form. There's this consistent oddity that I kept facing in studying something that's only half linguistic, a paratext that escapes the category of paratext. And that middle ground became very crucial to my understanding of the chapter and crucial to my book. There's also something peculiarly significant, I think, about the way agency is distributed in the shaping and arrangement of chapters. It's distributed unpredictably. It's potentially recoverable. One can always do a chapter with full intentionality in some unique or experimental way, but also completely dispensable or disposable. One can do a chapter in the most rote of ways. And that's the oddity of this innocuous form. And I should say that, early on in my plan for the book, I was often asked this, and I decided this was a good idea, that my chapters would inform the chapters from the era they were discussing. That eventually became completely impossible. And in fact, I defended this in my head by saying that, no, actually, my chapters are going to have to be conventional because this is a book about conventionality at some deep level. So the experimentation went away. In some ways, this persistent oddity, the misfit of the relation between the chapter and the various categories that have been proposed for it, like paratext, or Francis Ferguson's term divisional marker, Irving Goffman's term episode and convention, or from cognitive science, the term event segmentation. The fact that the chapter doesn't seem to fit easily into any of those for me, or seems to escape them, I think explains for me one other thing I just want to briefly mention, which has emerged for me since I finished the book, which is the role of all things, the 19th century novel chapter in this book. This is a kind of question for me about my lingering attachment to 19th century fiction and why I have it, despite the fact I have zero attachment to the period itself, no special affection for it or investment in it as a period, but an attachment to actually a collection of objects that seem to me far stranger than they tend to be given credit for. And one of those strangenesses is their employment of chapters. The 19th century chapter is where it seems to me the chapter comes fully into its own, no longer sort of referencing pre-novelistic or informational uses of the chapter, no longer mimicking dramatic scenes or phases or stages of life or dramatic acts. It's very much its own new weird thing in the 19th century, new in the history of units. Not quite experimental, but increasingly autonomous from other regimes of segmentation, following a distinct logic that can borrow at times from these other units, but never completely identifies with them. It's also something that, and this became more salient to me the longer I worked on the book, has undergone, by this I mean the chapter, something of a status collapse. The chapter is more likely to be identified now with remediality. So think of the generic term chapter book in American English, right? It's that artifact of early literacy, the stage when a child is just mature enough to be able to cope with interruption, with books that can't be consumed in a single sitting. This is almost like the temporal equivalent to object persistence, right? The idea that you can leave an experience or put it into abeyance and it will be there when you come back. More than merely innocuous, actually, there's something ever so slightly abject about chapters now. And that status collapse, I think it's now clear to me, had consequences for the way the book was written, consequences I didn't see while I was actively writing it, except stumbling constantly across contemporary writers of different kinds, contemporary critics, contemporary novelists being snide or dismissive about chapters. An example is James Wood, who called chapters corsets, the kind of like straightened thing that you can just simply take off and never fit into again. That is, the chapter is old, unnecessary, excessively or solely conventional, or above all, a kind of obsolete novelistic etiquette. One aspect of writing a book, and to talk about this just for another minute, is the immediate foreignness the book presents to you when you've finished it. This question is like, what did I do here? What was I doing? What was I not aware I was doing? And you start to notice the tics you have, the loose ends you didn't follow up, the obsessions that you weren't aware you had. And that's meant for me pondering what the appeal of the chapter was to me at a moment of what became clear to me was its status collapse. It was also pointed out to me that I use the word, maybe Joe can address this too, perhaps, is I use the word capitulation a lot in this book without ever recognizing what that word means in other contexts. So one question for myself is, what was I capitulating to in writing this book? I suppose my biggest question to myself would now be, is this book an elegy? Is it an elegy for something like the chapter itself? Is it recognizing a certain kind of end to the chapter's bookishness? Something about the tie this chapter has to a form or genre that's in flux or possibly in decline? Is my history of the chapter, like, Minerva taking wing, not just at sunset, but way, way after sunset, a kind of lament, but for what? And that still isn't quite clear to me. And maybe this explains what I think is the book's recurrent and maybe symptomatic turn, particularly in its final third, to this mode I define as poignancy in chapter breaks, this minor but very pervasive mode that I define as the anticipation of an end indefinitely but only temporarily held off. The affect I think that chapters increasingly produce. And that has, admittedly, a kind of elegiac tinge to it, or incipiently elegiac tinge to it. Or maybe this is a book in love with historical irony. Irony maybe as a way to evade the pull of elegy. So much of the book is about what I call the de-informationalizing of the chapter, its gradual turn, however present it was from the beginning, from a technique of information management to an aesthetic form, or a form that can occasion aesthetic play. But that's something that happens often inadvertently or accidentally or by some kind of collective unconscious movement or agency is distributed across innumerable instances. The way changes in the shape of chapters are occasioned often by turning mistakes, maladaptive chapterings, let's say, into new aesthetic opportunities. And that irony may be my way of holding out some sort of hope or some sort of resistance to elegy, or maybe even some kind of interest in persistence or even renewal. That other promise, that think about the Radio Shack ad, that other promise extended by the chapter, that something new will begin. However, it will only be incompletely different from what came before. It's the comfort of continuity and difference coexisting. It's what William James called co-conscious transition. So is it, in fact, that I'm arguing on behalf of some kind of endurance for the continuity of things too seemingly minor to ever be convulsive, simply for the virtues of survival? So those questions remain open to me, and they're kind of needling me. I can only say that I'm unable to answer them as yet. So how would I end? How should I end my remarks? If I were a chapter of the sort often present in the Gospels, I might end right now, all of a sudden, maybe even in the middle of a sentence. If I were a medieval chapter, I might conclude by some very minor act of digital manipulation, turning this paper over, holding up my hand, asking someone to open a window, to briefly suspend what I have to say. If I were an 18th century chapter, I might say, and now my time is over. I won't test your patience further. I hoped you liked that. Please stick around for what comes next. If I were a Victorian style chapter, I would end by putting my head down and slowly nodding off to sleep, inviting you all to do so as well. If I were a post-war chapter, I might end in a meditative silence, asking us all to hold the moment for as long as we can, knowing that it won't last long, or just stop suddenly as if a cut had kind of fallen across my time. But these remarks were none of these, so I'll confine myself to doing what chapters almost always do in any time and place and say I'm looking forward to what happens next. Thanks.
I love this book so much. So I'm sorry for what's about to fall down. The chapter is not a particularly personal book, but there is a scene early on in which the writer presents himself for our examination. Once, when faced by a sudden change in the circumstances of his life, he tells us, he visited an analyst who explained the writer's situation to him in terms that he could understand. You're starting a new chapter. The writer, an intelligent and ardent reader of novels, found himself encouraged, emboldened by the metaphor. It suggested a threshold over which he would be propelled, a feeling of a before, and with it, the promise of an after. And even if there was a moment of hesitation or a delay in the crossing of this threshold, it would be no real impediment to progress, only an irony to be laughed at later on. Remember when we almost didn't, but then we did? There were other metaphors, other images that the writer had collected over the years, for as he knew, there was no shortage of ways to measure the passage of time. He preserved these other images on the first page of his book, where I now read them with interest, admiration, and a growing curiosity. The swell and the crash of a wave, the ripening and rotting of a fruit, the opening and closing of a shutter, the transit of an eclipse. I read on for several pages, but I could not help thinking, as I turned the metaphor of the chapter over in my mind, that the writer needed a new analyst. The idea of a break, a clearing in time from which one could vault onto a fresh, blank page. No, it seemed entirely wrong to talk about life like this. And when I thought about what seemed right, my mind wandered through a less cheerful grouping of scenes. Here was a woman sitting in a room, mending the dress she was to wear to her party that night, when her old, quarrelsome lover burst in upon her and interrupted the happiness she had fashioned in his absence. There, outside a brothel, a man spied a changeling boy in an Eton suit, smiling and reading a book, and he recognized in the boy the face of his son who had died 11 years ago. In a great house in the south of England, a novelist pored over his earlier works, and his reputation for mastery, for infallibility, made him shamefacedly aware of his younger, crueler, undistinguished self. Searching for the right metaphor to describe the timing of my scenes, I fished one out of the writer's heap of discarded images. The break of the waves, following each other, pursuing each other, and I thought about how, in their depths, the current carried 2 or 3 eternally flickering wishes. Youth is forever, love never dies, and the dead will rise again. Now, all that perhaps had to be left out by the analyst as he sat in his chair and responded not to what the writer had said, but to the hope or the dream behind it. It was a dream of forward movement, of sequential advance. At its most refined, this movement was not turbulent. It was smooth and unwrinkled. It unfolded with clarity and in silence. Above all, it was subject to a certain conscious control. First this happened, then that happened. Could one live in a straight line? Perhaps in Victorian novels one could. I looked at the novels on the table next to me. Their very titles, The Waves, As I Lay Dying, Nightwood, seemed to mock the idea. I picked one up and opened it to a freshly creased edge, a chapter break. I read the sentence before it. Oh, to awake from dreaming. Look, there is the chest of drawers. Let me pull myself out of these waters. But they heap themselves on me. They sweep me between their great shoulders. I am turned, I am tumbled, I am stretched among these long lights, these long waves, these endless paths with people pursuing. I read the sentence after. The waves fell, withdrew, and fell again like the thud of a great beast stamping. More mockery, it seemed. But there was something so ludicrous in thinking of modernism as that which needed to be repressed for the metaphor of the chapter to work in fiction or in life, or indeed by the logic of the book I was reading. I'm so glad you went from the Victorian chapter to the post-war chapter, Nick. Thank you. I was so worried. And yet, when I went looking for the chapters of modernism in the chapter, I could not find them. They seemed to have fallen into a gap in the book, and the gap had been covered up, maybe a little too hastily, I thought. In the 20th century, the writer insisted the chapter, and along with it, the eventful and rhythmic division of time, disappeared. It was engulfed into an unbroken vista of text, swallowed by the perpetual present of narration, or each chapter was transfigured into a perfectly sealed world, a world unto itself, bearing the same relation to the chapters before and after it that the Earth does to planets so distant that they fail to exert any gravitational pull. Yet the modernist chapter, at least as I knew it, seemed to me both less self-assured and more badly behaved than the writer claimed. It preened its way onto the page. Its breaks were irregular. Certainly, it abjured numbers and their sequencing, and often it ended not with a blank space, but with an emblem, a flower, an asterisk, the famous black hole. Yet its showiness concealed its peculiar fixity. Forever turning, forever brooding in the doorway of fiction, it could never pass over the threshold, could never arrive on the other side of the event or the mood, the span or the era whose beginning and end mark the orderly story, the well-ordered life. When I held it up to a harsher light under the modernist chapter's vivacity, I saw what looked like agitation, or agitation's more severe relation, despair. It was the kind of despair that would lead a narrator to command or to plead, life, stand still here, then task the first chapter with tunneling into one character's mind, the second chapter with another character's memory, the third with a dream, and the fourth with history, the very warp and woof of time, all without the novel ever moving forward with any plot or any purpose, but for the saving of life from time itself. With this vision in my mind, I looked again through the chapter, and now I saw the modernist chapter everywhere outside the Victorian novel. Here it was in the fractured rhythms of Equiano's narrative. Here it was too in the irregularity of Goethe's breaks and the skeptical timekeeping of Tolstoy. For all the writer's insistence that his book concerned the ordinary, the beautiful, the barely visible, and thus the modestly virtuosic chapter, every other example seemed to instance the chapter's striking insolence in the face of unfreedom. The chapter was the scale at which the novel staked its claim to autonomy by making the limits of its autonomy visible. It refused to calibrate the time kept by the novel to the time kept by life with its irreversible winding up and winding down of the clock. It refused to get over anyone, to forgive or to forget anything. Sometimes, as in the final book of Proust's masterpiece, the refusal transformed into a sensual plenitude in which everything one had experienced, all that one had lived, could be redeemed by the writer's gifts. Other times, as in Beckett's novels, the refusal emerged as a nihilism so bleak and unremitting that it turned absurd, hoarding bathos. But in Woolf, in Faulkner, in Barnes, in Hemingway, in late James, and even in Joyce, Equiano, Goethe, and Tolstoy, the chapter's refusal was neither triumphant nor agonized. It was not even cautiously optimistic. It was steeped in melancholy. Its mode was thoroughly elegiac. Its glance was turned backward, not forward. But as I say, the analyst did not think of this, or maybe he believed it advisable or generous not to say what he really thought. Or perhaps where some of us experience linearity, others experience mostly cyclicality, and with it, life as a series of repetitions with only the faintest of differences. We feel the days that run underneath this one. We feel time in its transparent loops as it passes beneath us now. Thank you.
Well, if we're arrayed up here as chapters, I think I'm probably going to be one of these Machadian, pathetic, deflationary chapters following Merveille's tour de force. This is a book where a whole bunch of lights went off in my head on a little console in my brain as I was reading it. There's the light that goes on when I'm reading a book and I'm in the presence of knowledge being created. You know, questions are being answered and I'm learning things. And there's a little light next to it when the book is actually teaching me to ask new questions I hadn't thought about asking. And then there's another light that goes off when I think I could give this to a graduate student and say, not only you will learn answers to questions from this book, but this is how it's done. This is method and the making of method. And it's I think this book is a masterclass in literary and book history together, and also literary and book history at scale, at an ambitious scale that is rarely attempted in book history and even more rarely succeeded at. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But really also a masterclass in the definition of a question. and finding a method to answer that question. I think Nick and I first made contact around our shared interest here when I was maybe between two chapters in my professional work. So I actually don't remember what year we started talking about this stuff, Nick. I'm sure Radio Shack was still around. I was finishing a book about the Attic Nights of Aulus Gellius, which is an ancient Roman essay collection from the time of the Roman Empire that most classicists don't really have the time of day for. And I can't tell you how tickled I am to see it all throughout this book and to find that I seem to have convinced Nick that it's worth thinking with, which is incredibly satisfying as a classicist. I was finishing this book about this essay collection, and one of the last things I did for that book was write the first chapter in which I tried to have an argument about how the chapter headings in this ancient Roman book worked. It being one of the very few ancient Roman texts that comes down to us with both something like a literary ambition and something like a table of contents. And I was also trying to figure out, because I had started looking at what we call incunabular editions, so 15th century printed editions of this text, why the table of contents to this ancient book looked so weird in the early modern printed editions of the book. That would go on to be sort of a next project. And that was a process of constantly reassessing what question I thought I was asking. And particularly, I had an experience similar to the one Nick has described of trying to answer a question and realizing how much further back you're going to have to go, or you open a door and you're in a much bigger room, and then you get across the room and open a door and you're in a much bigger room, right? So I was trying to understand the printing of an ancient Roman table of contents in the 15th century, but what was the situation with other tables of contents in the 15th century? And what did they look like in the manuscripts before the age of printing? And what the hell was going on with the Bible? Which is like, I mean, Nick will explain that to you, but there was no way I could possibly get to grips with it. And each of these successive questions was something I realized I didn't even have the training to begin to answer. And actually going and trying to get that training totally changed the direction of my work as a scholar. And the simple question I was trying to answer, why does this table of contents look like this in these 15th century books? I eventually had to take refuge in the form that I was writing, which was a chapter for an edited volume. You know, I had like 8,000 words or whatever. And I just had to sort of pull the ripcord and draw a line around the question and say, there's so much here to answer. And by that point, I knew that my friend Nick was going to answer a lot more of it, and I could leave the problem to him. And so I was so delighted to read this book and see that he had somehow found a way to do this. This is important, I think, for a couple of reasons. In book history, the way I explain book history to students is that it's basically a field invented by European medievalists and early modernists, for whom the medieval and the early modern book is the most interesting one, and in some way the specimen of the book. And because of the way academics work and because of the way we stake claims for the significance of our work, book historians have had this habit of trying to plant flags around technological and formal revolutions. So the classic one of these is Paul Sanger's claim that in the 12th century, monks invent silent reading. And you can see this in the manuscripts. Then there's the old claim that the printing press changes how people read in Europe. And book history is now a field practiced and pursued by people who study many more cultural and linguistic contexts. And this mode is increasingly kind of creaky and no longer bears weight. But one of the consequences of this medievalist and early modernist kind of impetus from the field is that the ancient book in Europe and the Mediterranean has always been necessarily relegated to a kind of antediluvian barbarism. For the medieval book to have made revolutionary things happen, for the early modern book to have made revolutionary things happen, the ancient book needs to have been simplistic. Ancient reading needs to have been simplistic. Now, of course, this is like a teleological Whig history that very few of us would actually set out to practice at scale. But it's a habit that I think the field found itself stumbling into. And this is why you will find claims, for example, that nobody in the ancient world could read silently, which is like on the face of it absurd. And also there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, but there's this one scene in Augustine and everyone goes, oh my God, no one in ancient Rome could read silently. Of course, what this misses is a key feature in the history. Well, we might just say history of culture generally, but Nick flags its presence in the history of the chapter, which is the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows, the cycles of forgetting and rediscovery and reinvention that necessarily mark something as durable across so many changes as the book, as a category, right? Books become complicated and simple. They become convoluted and straightforward over and over again through time. Nick, it put me on the spot about what capitulation means, which is, I had a similar experience recently, was invited to a workshop on collaboration in ancient literature, by which I think the organizers meant the sort of like cheerful idea of Cicero and his friends sitting down to sort of revise a work together. And they asked me to come talk about, because I was interested, as Denise has said, in slavery and the way that slave labor is implicated in the making of Roman books. And I had to sit there and say, you guys know that collaboration has another meaning, right? You think about this for a minute. So capitulation, Nick, if I'm not mistaken, in the early Middle Ages, to capitulare in Latin was to make something that had capitula. And as you talk about in the book, what has more capitula than legal documents? So to capitulate was to draw up the terms of surrender, to come to terms with your foe. Presumably it means a kind of total surrender because it's all laid out there in black and white, I think. How does Nick come to terms with the challenge of his topic in this book? Well, one of them is to find a way to close read chaptering itself. That, I think, is one of the most exciting and provocative and interesting things about this book. As Nick was saying, he has found a way to close read things that are not entirely linguistic, and indeed are partly about absence, partly about kind of white space or dark matter or implied spaces between. Nick talks about the way that the chapter returns breath, the pause of breath, to prose. I was reminded of some recent work on ancient papyri, where scholars were trying to figure out where the scribes paused to re-ink their pen. And they seemed to have a bias towards doing it at the end of words, as if the sense units that make up language necessarily shape the pragmatics of how we make text. I couldn't help but think, as I read, of another 15th century book I once saw, an edition of Pomponius Mela's Geography, a classic example of an ancient book where the chapters flow straight from the subject matter. Here's the part on Spain. Here's the part on Italy. Here's the part on Gaul. I actually have been carrying it around all day looking at it. Here's what the page looks like. A very boring 15th century page. You see at the bottom, the chapter ends. At the bottom of the page is the header for the next chapter. In between are about 6 blank lines, very unusual for a 15th century book. And in the blank space, they've come back and printed nihil hic de est. Nothing is missing here. This space intentionally left blank. Why did the 15th century printers need to do this? Well, someone screwed up. This blank space shouldn't have been there. There's an error in casting off, I think. Why did they have to put this message there? Because in the 15th century, as text was being remediated from manuscript to print, any open space in a book seemed to imply a loss in transmission, that the white space meant something had been missing in the manuscript in the previous stage. And what Nick's book made me think about really is, what is a pause, right? Where do pauses come from? Who is pausing? What is pausing? What makes us pause and what happens in the pause? And what do they mean? And these questions all have both kind of consistent universal answers and locally specific answers that I think Nick draws out in a beautiful way. So I should stop talking. The question that came to me rather flippantly as I finished the book is, when will Nick now write the history of the 3 carriage returns, or of the 3 centered asterisks, these other kinds of breaks, right? But I actually wanted to end with a more specific question for Nick. And your comments, Nick, confirmed my suspicion that this started as an attempt to answer the question of the chapter in the novel in a very specific time and place. And you talked about going back and back and back. And as I've tried to express, I have real admiration for the success with which you have deployed this kind of historicizing method to book and literary history. In the Lithum Preceptor seminar today, at the end of the semester, much as at the end of the book, we were talking about Apuleius's Golden Ass. And I had said to the preceptors, look, this is a novel. And one of our brilliant English and Complet PhD students said to me, okay, but I was trained on the 19th century novel. Why this looks nothing like a novel? What makes this a novel? And so my question really for you is, I think it's very clear that the questions that your historicizing method let you ask of the chapter in the novel revealed some things about how novels work. And I wondered if they had changed your understanding of what a novel is. What is the ontological status of a novel and relative to literariness? So I'll end there. Thank you for this book.
So I began reading this book on a really long flight. It was a 17-hour flight. And I quickly found myself kind of completely incapable of having any critical distance from it, which I felt like disqualified me from commentary. And there are multiple reasons for that. One reason is that I am just like predisposed to the topic. And so, you know, I just loved it right away. And I'm teaching a course on formal methods. You know, on my bookshelf, you find books and footnotes, you know, books like Dictionary of Distances. What else do we have here? Elements of Typographic Style, Taxonomy of Office Chairs. I mean, I'm just happy to, you know, to be there. And even if this was a dry sort of encyclopedia of like chapter pictures, I would like already love it. But besides being a comprehensive history with some, you know, significant thought, it is really devastatingly well written. And so as I was reading it on the plane, I found myself often kind of pausing after sentences, you know, and I think like, tell me if I'm wrong, like kind of in the style of, you know, like Sebald or Thomas Brown, De Quincey, that kind of hypnotic phrasing where you read the sentence and you're like, okay, I got to take a break. Like I cannot handle another sentence like this. But interestingly, you know, because as you heard, the thesis of this book is that there is a structuring of your time happening through the chapter headings. But interestingly here, the style was making me pause. And because of the content, I was kind of like hyper aware of what my body is doing and kind of how my time is being structured. So that was another reason to, you know, another difficulty in maintaining a distance. And finally, unexpectedly, it is a really funny book at times, and like kind of dry, kind of, you know, hidden humor. And I want to give you an example. Is that the chapter 1 ends with this, you know, really with the thesis of this chapter. Books are containers of time, and chapters give that time its most visible and yet flexible expression. Chapters, in this sense, are where novels are at their best. They're most bookish and they're most time engaged. To grapple with their shape and intent, even in the case of something as faintly etched as the 9th chapter of Excellent Women, one must take a long detour back into the history of textual division. Now, this is interesting, back into the history of textual division. We're going forward, but, you know, so, okay, already kind of clever stuff happening beyond the birth of the codex. And you heard a little bit, and by the way, you know, also, this took me on a long side quest on liturgical texts and the role of rubrics in liturgical text as kind of instructions for the composition of a text that you know, during service that you're pulling from different sources. And there's instructions of actual ritual and behavior that for me as a digital scholar, you know, remind of like kind of code instructions contained in contemporary text. But anyway, so as I was doing this, but listen to this, such a history will have lessons for the most commonplace and the most outlandish handlings of chapters alike, period. Part 2. So chapter 1, then, you know, you'd expect chapter 2. So this is really like, I was like, I mean, I had to stop again. But then I was like, but wait a second. He did just say it's outlandish. I mean, this is an outlandish break, and you do feel kind of, you feel a little wink, and you feel, you feel your consciousness manipulated in a particular way, and you in practice you see that I'm being asked to return and truly to go back as promised. I am going back into the introduction to sort of help me process what I just witnessed. So now, for all these reasons, like I said, I feel entirely kind of disqualified as a critical kind of commentator, and I would like to just join you as a in celebration of this book, and again to tell you how much I enjoyed reading it.
Goodness, I don't know where to begin. I'm going to go in reverse order, sort of like I did at the end of my introduction. Dennis, let me just meditate for a bit about the fact that you read my book on a plane. I think I have a lot to say about this, including the fact that for whatever reason in my own head, and I think I do mention it once, and it may be at the end of the brief first, this sort of preface. Okay, so first of all, I can't read on a plane to save my life. There's just no way I can read on a plane. I'm far too drugged to consume text. And yet the operative metaphor for me, or the kind of deep metaphor for me about the conclusion of a chapter actually was something in relation to vertigo, the fear of falling. And I think I do it in the very first chapter break of my book, talk about the feeling of ending as the feeling of like falling into open space. And that it was an attempt. There's something about embodiment and the pause that I think I was capturing through a series of metaphors, some of which I was conscious of, some of which I don't think I was conscious of or fully in control of. But that was an attempt to understand that break as the moment of embodiment. So the moment at which one I think might be most conscious of having a body. And so this is, I feel like, increasingly a thread in the book. Different kinds of embodiment are addressed by different kinds of breaks. I'm interested, for instance, in what I called in my remarks digital manipulation. So fingers, hands, how often these things are hailed in the process of breaks, but also certain kinds of physiological responses. Whether sleep, which is a major topic of the book, and the kind of thing I would love to be able to do on a plane one day, and certain sleep, a sense of one's own, this kind of feedback effect almost that the chapter break can have. And so I'm interested in the way in which what gets activated by those moments of embodiment may not entirely be, and this will take, I'm going to leap ahead, I'm doing these leap ahead to what I sort of want to talk about in relation to Merve's, was what? It's not always comfortable, I guess maybe would be the thing I would say, and that I was very aware of discomfort and physical discomfort being the way in which embodiment is registered so often at these moments of pause. And you were reminding me of this, for which I thank you. Say one word about the taxonomy of office chairs, which is that there is a part of me still that wishes this book had been something like that, because that was its original vision, was something, I see the book there, I don't know it, I kind of want to buy it. There was something, like a vision of a book that's like elegantly taxonomical, that this never became. And maybe I still have an attachment to that original vision, but what gets in the way, or what got in the way for me, was the historical impulse there. So that brings me to Joe's remarks. And Joe, I'm glad you had a moment of what memorialization, because so much of my early education about particularly the initial chapters of this book came from talking to Joe over coffee, but particularly reading Joe's work as it was in formation and then in its finished form. So one of the reasons it's kind of wonderful to hear him talk about this, Gellius was in many ways a kind of starting point for me, or an orientation point at least, as I worked my way backward. I want to, a couple things I want to say about address, and I'm mindful of the fact, how did this book change, Joe's question, how did this book change my understanding of what a novel is something that I frankly need to meditate more on. I sometimes think that in an almost psychoanalytic vein, I don't know if it changed my understanding, but it surfaced an understanding that I wasn't aware of having, or it allowed me to play with a certain kind of understanding that I had been keeping at bay for all kinds of methodological or professional reasons. And that is, I think, what I said earlier tonight, which is something about rhythm, something about actually bodily rhythm, and maybe even some sense of the novel as having not just inculcated a rhythm, but like tamed certain rhythms. And that maybe a novel is a process of sort of bodily taming, the taming that is, among other things, necessary to read it all. But let me say a bit about, Joe, your point about book history, and the which I completely endorse. That, and I was shocked. I mean, I felt like this was maybe something that I was making up in my head when I kept reading book historians who were early modernists and medievalists, insisting that the chapter is an invention of their period, and thinking, I can't be reading that, right? Like, they know so much more than I do. How can they not be right about this, but yet they're patently wrong? It later occurred to me that it's a peculiarity of the chapter itself, in some ways, that it carries with it this bizarre rhetoric of newness, or rhetoric of innocence, rhetoric of just having been invented, that can fool you. This is true all the way. I think if you had asked me when I first had this project come into my head a long time ago, if you'd asked me when chapters began, I would have said something like the 18th century. How wrong, how deeply wrong I was about that. But that is because so often when it is used in this paradoxical way, where it is completely imitative and yet presents itself as if it's an improvisation, as if it's being invented on the spot. And I can absolutely see how that would fool any book historian. I'm acutely aware as I write this that I myself might be fooled still. Like, there's still other dimensions to this that I've been tricked into not seeing because of that strange feature of chapters, that they resist a sense of their own traditionality at the same time that they're completely embodying it, which is a wonderful way to survive, I think. So speaking of psychoanalysis, let me turn to Mary, who has absolutely acutely identified the book's, I don't know what the right word is, the book's repressed, the book's bad conscience, which is modernism, sure. Although, yes, I will. Now, why? So why would I be repressing it? Why is that the source of some tension here? And I do. I mean, it's one of the things one sees when one finishes a book, is you see what you left out, and that you left it out for a reason. That reason, though, isn't always immediately apparent. I can give you one. Reason off the top of my head, but it may not be sufficient. A voice that was in my head as I was writing this whole book, and I think I gestured to this a little bit in my opening remarks, is the kind of contemporary late modernist who refuses the chapter in the name of modernist experimentation, and for whom the 19th century novel is the sort of cliched enemy. And I do have a moment late in the book where I, in a way that a lot of it was cut, I should say, and it was cut rightfully so, because I'd gone on way too long, which was a sign of some sort of symptomaticity. An argument I picked with Will Self, of all people, who says something very close, actually, Mary, to something you said, although you said it much more, not just elegantly, but with actual meaning attached to it. Self said, life doesn't come in chapters, right? Life doesn't have chapters. Now, the more I thought about this, it bugged me from the minute I heard this. The more I thought about it, the less convincing I found it. And part of what I wanted to stress was, in fact, something like, no, damn it, life does come in chapters. Or at least chapters have no more or less existence in our sense of time than minutes or hours or any arbitrary measure. The chapter, at least, is far more elastic and can do some more interesting things than those other modes. But I think I would say the two reasons I wanted to pick the fight, one of which is I thought this idea that life doesn't come in chapters was actually wrong cognitively. We need to segment experience in order to actually have experience. This is one of the lessons I've taken from cognitive science. But also weird, and this is something maybe you can help me think through, how weirdly aesthetically conservative I found this position of his, how it presents itself as hypermodern. Let's get rid of these old things, but actually rests on at least a 100-year-old convention of something like the explosion of a convention, at least some convention of much more unmarked continuity. And I suppose what I wanted to defend is some idea that segmentation of this kind is an aesthetic effect. Some form of it may be necessary. It can't be entirely dispensed with or wished away. And that aesthetic effect has a flexibility that isn't accounted for in the kind of sweeping Will Self gesture saying, well, life isn't in chapters, we shouldn't have chapters. To me, that's a kind of one of those insights that is deeply banal, but presents itself as brilliant. And that may say everything I want to say about Will Self himself. Anyway, but that fight I'm picking there with a figure that I'm otherwise not interested in now leaps out to me as, okay, this is about something. This is about my interest in maybe in this, forms of fiction that leap over modernism in some way, or maybe a better metaphor would be sort of like are like culvetted underneath it, and can almost pretend, like Barbara Pym, who's this book's first example, that it never happened. What is that I want to imagine forms of history that in which certain ruptures never occurred, which takes me back to maybe that scene in the therapist's office that you, I think, rightfully point out. That moment may have been an effort to try to get me to imagine a form of time where some rupture didn't occur by regularizing that rupture. You're moving forward, keep moving forward. I do need to think more about this, but I think you've absolutely identified the book's repressed. And what does one do when the repressed has been identified? Is just kind of sit in silence. And that's time for the session to be over, and so go home and think about it for a few days. So yeah, but thank you for that.
Questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Nick, I'm so excited about this book, and Excellent Women is one of my favorite novels. So now I'm even more excited, and these beautiful responses to it have also made me even more excited about it. I also think life comes in chapters, and I'm interested in last chapters, and I was going to in lives, and I'm writing about last works at the end of the Enlightenment. So end of a period, end of a life, and last work. So I wanted to ask you if last chapters in any part of the history of the chapter that you would want to address this in are a different form, genre, or beast. I understand it's not quite a form, it's not quite a genre, but this idea of looking back as opposed to looking forward, I loved what you said about that. I often have a sense of disorientation at the end of a book. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. So the idea of falling, the idea of loss, obviously, but disorientation is a little different. And what you said about the bodily experience of reading generally and the way that time is marked. So is it a different beast? And, you know, I don't like Dostoevsky personally. That Crime and Punishment is my least favorite novel on the Lidham syllabus. But that epilogue, you know, is the epilogue like a different, is that a chapter? Is that a different genre? But more generally, last chapters.
This was something that I admittedly never adequately solved and didn't, as a result, never directly confronted if what I'm talking, if that is chapter forms of closure exert some kind of influence on closure. Part of this is a question about actually how, look, one other thing that I'm actually somewhat grateful that no one's raised up at this point, but I've realized in looking over the book is how death haunted this book is actually weirdly. Like it is, I was not aware of it when I was coming up with my instances, but realizing that I'd written a chapter that was almost entirely books that are about the dying or dead. And the way in which the segmentation of time, internal segmentation of time reflects that haunting. But there are also ways in which the chapter can evade that recognition. So one of the ways, and I don't quote it in the book, but I was struck by was actually there's a definition of chapters. I'm saying this partly to appeal to you, Joanna, is in the Encyclopédie, under the entry for book, I think, there's a definition of chapters as, which I don't quite understand. It's a metaphor that I don't know enough about interior decoration in the 18th century, but the book is a chandelier and chapters are the little, the little branches of a chandelier, each with their individual candle, which is a great image, but it's detemporalized, right? That fascinates me, that like chapters do always have this potential to be imaged in ways that aren't necessarily temporal, but are a different kind of part-whole relationship. And in other words, like some measure of repression is involved. Let me just, one other thing about this is that I don't know if this is true last chapters, but it is true with other stronger forms of closure. So one of the important, I wouldn't say arguments, but suggestions that was made to me early on was that, well, of course, this may be right to a certain extent about a certain kind of novel chapter in the 19th century, but of course, that's going to be different at the end of serial installments. It's going to work differently, right? Because that's just a stronger beat. And in ways, I won't go into the argument, but in ways that are both, I was able to ascertain somewhat, computationally is too fancy a term, but through numbers, put it that way. But also through some forms of close reading, I think my argument is no, actually. That the weight, almost like this kind of gravitational pull of the way chapters normally end, exerts itself and influences every other form of closure, even ones that should be stronger. Whether that's true about endings, I'm not certain, right? But and it's not an argument I make, but the sleep endings of novelistic chapters, they're little deaths, and the chapter is a kind of little death, and so I think there has to be a relationship there. Again, I guess my argument would probably be if the force of influence goes in one direction over another, it would probably be from the chapter ending to the ending rather than the other way. Or what? Or chapter endings are a way of fending off the ending.
Thank you. I haven't read the book yet, Nick. So this is one of those questions where I'm like terribly afraid I'm going to ask something incredibly obvious that you're going to be like, oh, I talk about that at length on page 2. Mavet's remarks have actually made me a little more confident it's not that kind of question, but I'm going to take you back to modernism. And I'm thinking particularly about Ulysses.
Yep.
And I'm thinking about chapters that disavow the title of chapter and the way that Joyceans in particular refer to the parts of Ulysses as episodes.
Yes.
Right. And they, of course, derive from the books of the Odyssey that we've inherited from a particular version of Homer that is not Homeric.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm also thinking about the way in which in Ulysses, those chapters very clearly mark temporal movement, but also endings. So they seem to be at once entirely consistent with what you're claiming for the temporal work of the chapter. And yet they disavow the name of the chapter. And it's also a quintessential modernist novel that doesn't opt for flux.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you account for that repressed object?
Well,
I guess is the form of a question.
Yeah. So I do have an account to this, actually. I mean, it's not. I hear I'm learning a lot. I learned a lot from Eric Polson's discussion in his Ulysses in Numbers book about the twists and turns of the name attached to those units. The way now section is the approved term. But of course, chapter keeps coming, Pound called them chapters. And it's the haunting of those terms by that name and so by that form that does kind of interest me. But they're clearly an effort to push them away. I suppose I'm arguing that, it's, well, all right, I'll give you the bones of the argument. And I realize more and more now that this is actually a polemical argument, that I have something at stake in this. Or it's an aesthetic preference, I guess I'm arguing for, and less of a neutral historical point, which is that there's a double movement in modernism that I call, on the one side, I call towards autonomization, the idea that the unit can stand alone. It can be excerpted, as was the case with Ulysses. It can become a coherent experience in and of itself. It refuses its place in a sequence, or imagines it has a partial independence from that sequence, or what I call total subsumption, which would be like the Proustian example, where this chapter just gets submerged into what seems like a sea of text. And what that pulls apart is, for me, the most interesting part. I actually think the most innovative and fascinating element of Victorian formal arrangement of fiction, which is, and the name, Bouts has a name for it, which I really like. He calls it vectorized temporality. That is, it is a temporality that there are linkages. It's forward moving, that it's linkages within a sequence, and it's holding in tension distinctness and sameness. It's holding it's independence and dependence are held in a really interesting equilibrium. And I suppose, and maybe in a caricatured way, I'm saying modernism rips that apart into two directions. And it turns out, I guess I don't like its ripping apart. Why I don't, that's possibly an unexamined prejudice of mine, which I should probably examine. But the question of the name of the Joycean chapters. Let me also say this, though. I am aware of the sloppiness around, the inevitable sloppiness that has to occur around the boundaries of what is the chapter and what is not. And this, I mean, Joe will know this better than anyone. I've found effects from teaching some classical literature. I've found effects in Ovid that seem absolutely like what I'm describing, but at the end of books in Ovid, or even some at the end of Homeric books, right? So like the boundary between the Homeric book and the influence it casts and the chapter is a lot fuzzier than maybe I'd like it to be. I think there's still a meaning to that distinction for a lot of reasons, but it's a fuzzy distinction. And so insofar as Joyce is somewhat on those old, on the form of the book as a separate unit, there's still a whiff of chapterness to it, right? Like it's not a book in that sense.
Strong up here. I'm not going to ask you about modernism, although I will say we all know you have an unexamined prejudice against it. This is not news. I actually want to ask the question that I'm sure is on page 2. And just to invite you to talk about the pleasure of the chapter, which we've been talking about death and a lot of sort of dour things. But I assume the point about the book is, why does this work so well? Why do we love it? I mean, I bet you we could all raise our hand. How many of us have a book in our bag? And how many of us stopped at the end of a chapter on the subway, even if it meant walking along the platform while reading? Maybe I'm just now being confessional. But the point is that we love them. I love them. Many people love them. We still use them. They have so many incredibly powerful effects, and they are very much associated with pleasure, readerly pleasure. And the segmenting of time, which I gather is a major theme, is obviously handy for all of us. So I guess my question is, if it's a question, like, discuss, like, how do you, did you, in writing this book, start with the idea that chapters are incredibly successful, pleasurable units, and then find all this death and stuff? Or what? Like, how do you think about these things together?
You find death no matter where you go, Sarah. So no, I absolutely started with pleasure, but I was unclear, as one tends to be with pleasure, what it is you're finding pleasurable. And then ended up confronting the ways in which that pleasure has been critiqued, or you've been instructed in ways to be suspicious of it, right? And I think that if there's any kind of two kinds of pleasure, maybe I'll just put it that way now. One kind of pleasure is in a certain kind of modes of lingering. Modes of, this is where Dickens, who I also have an unexamined prejudice against, did make his way into the book, because I do think this is one thing he's a master of, are these minor dissociative endings, this kind of vaguing out at the end of chapters that I find deeply pleasurable in ways that I understand, look, it lends itself to a certain kind of very familiar critique that what Dickens is doing by establishing these diurnal rhythms is capitulating to regimes of industrial time. Sure. But but it's nice to have one's capitulation made a little bit more comfortable for one, given that capitulation is to some extent inevitable. But we won't tread on that territory. The other is actually just flexibility. It really is like, and this was, I think it's the 6th chapter of the book where I come as close as I ever come to being taxonomical by just saying, look at all the things you can do with this in what might seem like a very stereotyped, caricaturable form. It can do so many things and do them all at once. And that like really subtle acrobatics is a source of aesthetic pleasure for me. And to some extent, that might have been the chapter of the book that was easiest to write. I mean, I think I wrote it at one stretch. It was just like, I know this because I've been a novel reader. And I can just explore the different interesting positions that one can take and leave it at that. Provide a catalog of what, at a certain moment, this thing can do. That moment actually passes, which is maybe where the book turns elegiac, right? The things one can do with the chapters a little bit stiffen or ossify, but something about flexibility, but minor flexibility. It's not showy. So that too appealed. Yeah.
Thank you all for this brilliant discussion. So all of this talk about embodiment and about the physical as well as cognitive training that happens in the pause that's invited with the chapter makes me emboldened to ask a question that I fear is just altogether impertinent, which is about the relationship between the chapter and the scene, or the chapter and the act. But I want to ask it in light of texts which have a dramatic structure, but which circulate primarily in print. So I'm thinking of something like Shaw's weighty prefaces and the acts which totally strain believability of audience attention being able to remain in the theater for that long, or more contemporary, something like Susan Laurie Parks's 365 Days, 365 Plays, in which really that work only ever exists in its entirety in a printed form. And I'm curious if you think those divisions are imitative of chapters. Does printed drama learn something from the structure of the chapter, or is there some other interplay? I'm curious how you think about the interplay between those forms.
Rebecca, you put it in a different way than I had thought. So I have a short answer for you about this, and it too is one of these things that didn't make it into the book, probably rightfully so. But that there's a recurrent temptation certain figures will take up to try to make the chapter into a scene, to try to restrict a chapter to a scenic unit. And I suppose one of the things that it's one of the arguments I have in the chapter on the Bible is that the chapter comes into its own when it emancipates itself from scenic divisions. But Henry James, to give you the example that I wrote about at one point, is very intent on resuturing chapters to scenes. There's a moment, couldn't be more flagrant in his notebooks where he says, I want to be masterful on the question of time, which means be masterful on my scenes, i.e. chapters. And if you look at, they're dramatic scenes. The chapters are restricted to a kind of scenic unity. They end with curtain lines. He's extremely conscious of this. He loves it. It's a way of transmuting his, it's a cliche, but failed experiment as a playwright into a form that he can actually master. That is it's both a recurrent temptation and something that is never really fully taken up, because it is this restriction in what is a form that I think it's a bad metaphor, but like in its DNA is meant to be far more amorphous. So there always this temptation to pull it back. And I tend to read, and maybe I'm wrong at this, like the anxiety of influence comes from the other direction, comes from drama toward the novel, this idea that there's something not neat enough about these divisions. They're not motivated enough. Drama knows how to do this, right? Drama has a whole aesthetic tradition about this, which the novel lacks. I think this is in James's head. Dramatic theory has a whole series of explanations, long, ancient explanations about why things are restricted in certain ways. Fiction has no such theory. Therefore, let us make our form more amenable to the things that have been adequately theorized. And in some ways, I think that the resistance to that stricture is what's at the heart of chaptering, as opposed to but it happens all the time. All the time. Charlotte Bronte says it's the beginning of one of the chapters of Jane Eyre. A chapter is like a new scene in a play. No, actually, and I think that very chapter shows no, that's not it. But the metaphor is always there, and it has a significant appeal for a long time.
Be sure to hit the button. Speaking of the industrial regulation of time, I apologize for my lateness. I was teaching till 7. So I may say things that were already part of the conversation. But listening here to both the conversations around pleasure and the conversations around disciplinarity, I was thinking hard about how I read. First of all, I mostly read on my Kindle these days. And the way I experience a chapter is not a peaceful segmenting of time. I experience it as a kind of reproach to my pleasure in the text. I want to keep reading. I shouldn't be reading. I should be marking papers. I should get out of bed. No, you want it, says the chapter end as I forge through to the next chapter. So isn't a chapter, even while it says, here, rest here, isn't it also kind of a challenge to pleasure, to a demand, in fact, that you defy the boundary?
We need to explore these differences in our Julie, I don't know. They say a lot about us as people, I think. No, but sure, yes, yes, no. There's a Janus face to this, where the freeing permission to leave is also a challenge to want to stay. And I do tend to, I think, emphasize the freeing permission to leave more than what you mentioned, but that, they only have meaning insofar as the other one exists. They're, I hate to use the word in this sense, but it's dialectical. And so, yes, but I might actually argue in a way that the departure from the text, putting it down, is the more challenging act. Or is the act, what you're being challenged to do is maybe to put it down and return to it later. to still have the desire when you're away from it feels to me like the more I don't know about difficult thing to do, but at least the challenge that I think often you are invited to have. 18th century chapters are really, really, as you would know, like they're really, really anxious about this. Super anxious about, are you going to come back? About keeping you too long. You know, the micromanagement of your state, that passes away into a kind of implicitness over time. But I think the desire is to be wanted in absence. Now we've gone into some weird places here, but but I think that is that's for me what I see as the challenge, is to walk away from it and still want to come back, or to be forced away from it and still want to come back. Yep. You know it'll be there. You know it'll be there, and yes, right. And the desire is durable enough to withstand the absence. Yeah. I just go.
I have to turn this on. No, it's on. Yeah, I also haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to the book. And I guess I just wanted to ask you, I'm really intrigued by, you know, a project that is both kind of formal and historical. It's my own kind of obsession. So I just was wondering if you could talk a bit about the historical argument. To what extent, you know, is this like a history of like material, like the material of what books are made of? Like you talk about, you know, different kind of ways in which, you know, texts are organized, you know, codices, papyri, novels. And to what extent is it about like what it is to be a narrative in different points in time, or like to what extent, so you're talking about like the history of like understanding of time itself? So I don't know. I'm just kind of
Jessica, I feel like I have a one-word answer, which is yes.
Yes.
All
about it before I read it.
No, there is a spine to it though. Although all those things are true, but the basic spine to it is that there are peculiar experiments in chaptering that are more or less ancient, that are ways of organizing non-narrative texts, and that those methods of organizing non-narrative texts, which are practical in a sense, they're problem solving, not always. I mean, and Alice Gellius is a great example of someone for whom the problem solving was an occasion for aesthetic play, but the impetus is a kind of problem solving, and often quite brilliant problem solving technique. When you map those and when they get imported into narratives, which happens very early on, but when that happens, those techniques that existed to solve certain problems in the absence of those problems, now when you're attaching to a narrative, change their meaning, and in fact change their function. They become about temporal regulation and not about information management, and also become occasions for kinds of very long-lasting aesthetic traditions, but that are ironic often, because what you're doing is you're taking local solutions to local problems, sometimes extremely local, like this is how you chapter this text. But you notice something's done in those things that can then become sort of inserted into a completely foreign genre that then it then becomes a kind of a purely aesthetic manifestation. And there are a lot of ways in which that occurs. I mean, but I think the main one for me does originate, I mean, frankly, it originates in the, to be really local about it, it originates in the chaptering over a long period of time of the Gospels, which introduces a whole set of bizarre techniques, I guess I'll call them, into later narratives that don't have those same problems, that don't have the local problems of how you segment the Gospels aren't going to be the same problems about how you segment Tristram Shandy, but weirdly the same techniques are applied, but now consciously and with a conscious kind of perversity. So that's I guess the main bones of the historical argument. It does take detours through material history and book design, but ultimately maybe the ultimate purpose of all this is about it's cognition. It's about how information is organized and stored, whether that's information in a non-fictional sense or information in a fictional sense. Yeah.
I've noticed in my notes a compliment that I did not get out when I was speaking earlier. It has to do with the historical argument of the book. And I was put in mind by Joanna's question. Three things to say about the historical argument in this book. One, there are specific local arguments about like pre-modern history in this book that I think are like brilliant interventions that people in those fields would never have come up with. So like Nick's reading of the philosopher Epictetus, I think is like completely correct, and like no classicist would have come up with it. But then also, you know, I was kvetching about book historians' kind of reduction of antiquity to this antediluvian simplicity. And the thing that this book does is it makes distant historical frames explanatory of other time periods in a way that I think is really sophisticated. So the third thing to say is that in Nick's resistance of a kind of teleological development, even as he has this 2,000-year scope of history, I saw the fingerprints of something that didn't really crystallize for me until I got to the end and read the acknowledgements. And that's literature humanities. That, you know, we talk a lot, I talk a lot with the preceptors about how we resist the teleology of a course that starts in antiquity and ends with the modern novel, right? So the thing I want to say is like I actually want to give this to all my preceptors and say, look, this is how you can think transhistorically without thinking teleologically. And this is the kind of like synthetic knowledge creation you can do when you read outside your comfort zone and then like facilitate these conversations. So I just didn't want to leave without having said that.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you so much.